Welcome back to CS in 15. I'm Chris,
And I'm Jason.
and today we're talking about managing your book of business, how to stay on top of your customers and be effective in your day to day.
Chris, on that note, we all are aware fiscal years for any business is often when you start to see account transitions, whether accounts coming into your book, moving out of your book. It can often be a hectic time, and CSMs particularly, right? We can feel a bit overwhelmed. Curious to hear from you, and we'll start the discussion with this. When you are getting into managing your book of business, how do you handle accounts that are transitioning into your book? And then how do you prioritize your overall book after the fact? Let's start
Yeah.
there.
I think transitions are the time where you really have to flex like your book management and how you go about it methodically, because it's so easy to, right. Let's say you had 10 accounts and then you get 5 additional accounts because of transitions. It's really easy to stay in your flux of like how you are managing those 10 and then just try to take on those 5. I think it's a really good point in time to step back and holistically look at your book and kind of redo your prioritization and reconfigure, how much you're meeting with this customer, where you prioritize them on your matrix, how much you're engaging with them, whether they're a better fit to potentially be like a lower touch. Because I think if you just continue on with how you're managing that 10 and just try to loop in those 5, you're going to drive yourself into burnout. How about
Where do you
yourself?
begin? Where do you begin with the transition accounts? I think oftentimes there are a lot of data points lost in translation. I think there's previous expectations on service or lack thereof. So understanding that you think about, all right, I've already been managing these 10 accounts this way. How do you start the conversation with those newly transition accounts? Where do you begin that relationship?
Like, I think that's where expectation setting for a new account can be a lot easier than an existing account. It's a lot easier to come out of the gate with how you're going to manage them rather than trying to reset expectations with existing. You still have to do that. But for a new one, I think getting in and going into that first conversation, figuring out some of those more subjective data points, like in your CRM, you should easily know the ARR of the customer and what products they have, where they kind of are in product adoption. Maybe you have some telemetry into that. But the main thing is going to be getting into that conversation, asking if there's value delivery, because I think where they range on that spectrum is going to tell you a lot more about how much time you need to dedicate to them, depending on when their renewal is.
Yeah, that initial conversation, making that evaluation, understanding what they had in the past, did they perceive value, how are they managed? That sets like the next 3 months worth of work with that account, in my opinion. I'm going through it myself. I've gone through it a lot of times with other customers and other organizations, but oftentimes I find a transition account is a really good opportunity for you to show your refined CSM skills. And what I mean by that is, great example, you might have a customer, you get them in the first 3 months of you being at whatever your organization is. Maybe they happen to be a long-term customer. They stay with you for a year, 2 years, maybe even 3, right? If you've been there longer. That customer is used to the way that you were 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago when you started working with them, versus an account that transitions into you now. They can see the new you, right? They can see you as somebody who has refined their skills, refined your knowledge in your processes of your business, your product. They can see a new CSM in essence versus your current customers. So when it comes to transition accounts, first meeting almost always for me is, hey, I have a little bit of context, but I want to hear from you. What are your priorities? What are you focusing on? What's most important in the next 3 to 4 months for you? And that's where we're going to focus with each other. So that way, number one, I can understand what actually matters to them. Most of the time, notes that you get in transition accounts are probably going to be fairly accurate, but there's still room for that to be wrong. And then second, it's going to show them I'm willing to like get down and dirty, get in the tactical side of the house with them, which oftentimes when it comes to customers is what they want to hear. They want to see a CSM who's willing to do the work with them versus somebody who meets passively maybe once a month or something to that effect. So transition accounts are just a great opportunity for us to showcase our skill set as they've developed over however long we've been working in an organization.
When we also like get into that first conversation with that transition account, it's so good at that time to ask them, how has the experience been? Because I think there are a lot of situations where I'll take on a transition account and they had a really good personal relationship with their previous CSM. So maybe they didn't, you know, expand upon all of their concerns or the internal sentiment. It's a really good time to come in with that blank slate and ask, like, how does the organization actually feel about this investment? And try to get as much out of them as you can, because that will also feed into where they fall into that priority.
Oh yeah. And I think a lot of people forget to push it that far. They forget like, hey, how have you used it? How do you feel about it? A lot of people forget to take the extra step of like, how does the organization view this? Is this liked on the sales side? Is this liked by your C-suite? So I think pushing it that little extra step makes a big, big impact. Now, I think another topic when it comes to managing your book of business, obviously transitions can take up a lot of time, but overarchingly, how do you handle X amount of accounts? And start off with a hot take question. What do you think is too many accounts for an individual CSM to have in their book of business?
The hot take question is a really good one. I think it does matter on like what segment they fall into and just what type of products you're selling. I think if we're in like an enterprise, the too many accounts is anything that's over 30. I think when you're talking about an enterprise customer and considering like hopefully in a book of business, you have, you know, less at risk, healthy adopters, always going to renew year over year. And then your more at risk customers that are dedicating more time to. I think anything over 30, like the wheels are going to fall off. Preferably though, I think it's best if we're talking about like a strategic CSM that's truly in there, multi-threading across an organization, touching a lot of different personas, probably about 15. Oh
Okay,
yeah.
interesting. My hot take, I think segment wise, as you noted, it makes a big difference. I would probably drill in a little bit further and say budget wise or spend, I guess would be the better phrase. Like customers who spend K a year probably don't expect as much of a service level versus a customer who spends K a year, right? So I think segment does play a little bit into that. I will say for me personally, I feel like the cap out, and this is really on any segment where you want high renewal rates, is 50. At that point, for me, I feel like anything more than 50, you're really getting into water where I can't engage them. I can't keep track of them. I can't help them. I can't do what I need to do with them. But the way I look at it is like, even at 30, in your point, not all 30 are going to be asking you for something at the same time every single day. You're still right. If you're in like a biweekly cadence with these customers, you're meeting 30 minutes every other week. That's not that bad, right? Like that's not super heavy. Yes, there's still follow up. Yes, there's deck building. Yes, there's other things you need to do. But I feel like under 50, that should be pretty manageable for a CSM who can balance their time well, who can do follow-ups well, and really is on the ball. Anything more than that, I think you're going to be underwater. And I think back to a company that I was at one point, I had 120 customers, and that was purely unsustainable. Yes, they were lower value contracts, but even at 120, I probably knew and was able to keep up with like 20% of that. And that is much, right? But yeah, so back to prioritization. How do you prioritize? Where do you spend your time? Do you have a ranking system? What goes into that for you?
I think easily pulling on the objective levers of like, as we're mentioning, ARR, time till renewal, especially those higher value customers with a shorter term to renewal, making sure those conversations are happening. So kind of being more invested so you can multi-thread across those organizations, but then also just like risk detection. Where is there lower utilization of contracted units? Where is value lower? Where do I have less executive engagement? Looking at kind of all of those layers and using some of your subjective. I think for earlier stage CSMs, pull on those like ARR renewal date, use those and just do like a sorted list and navigate from there. But once you're a little bit more in your book, use kind of your lens to figure out where you need to dedicate some of your time and definitely putting it in rank order. So you can see like, okay, this month, this is my customer I need to turn around, and kind of looking at it as like a sprint cycle and continuously pulling accounts in, pulling accounts out based on where they're flexing to. I think is huge to not sit in like one rank order list of priority for the entire year, but more so reevaluating like, okay, is this customer trending upward? And maybe instead of rank number one, they can go down to like
Yeah, I like that. And I think I similarly model my book and where I spend my time. I will say any CSM who's not focusing on a customer that has a renewal within the next year, right? That like, I take that type of view as, oh, I know your renewal is coming up in a year. A year goes by fast. Like, let me tell you, the first month of 2025 went slow, but now February is getting close to being done. And, and however many months June's going to come around, right? So everything moves fast. So I look at renewals a year out and I start working that customer and they are very much top of mind for me. Secondary to that, even in a situation where you have customers who maybe renew 6 months from now or a year and a half, right? Obviously, contracts in different businesses have different types of contract lengths. But for me, renewals, personally, year out, go based off of whatever you guys work. If you are yearly renewals, you probably want to focus on them 6 months out or 4 months out. Secondary to that is accounts with perceived risk. So you touched a little bit on adoption, which I think really makes a big impact. I haven't seen on LinkedIn. People are like, don't worry about talking to your customers about their adoption. Your POCs and stakeholders don't want to hear about their usage. I'm like, yes, the hell they do. Never have I been engaged with a customer where they're like, yeah, I don't care how my team's using it. Like, talk to me about goals. It's like, okay, it's good for me to know your goals, but you also need to understand how your team's using the product. So secondary bucket for me is very much perceived risk based off of usage, based off of value, based off of lack of usage, right? Like there's a lot that can go into that perceived risk bucket, but that's where I spend probably the second most amount of my time as accounts where I'm like, I know your renewal is a year away, but I know how you're not using our product. Let me focus on you. Third bucket for me then simply is like kind of everybody else, right? Like who are the customers where we do have a healthy relationship, they do have good usage, there is some upsell or cross-sell opportunity. But for me, I'm very much focusing on that renewal and risk bucket because most organizations are going to goal CSMs off of gross renewal and net renewal. So, or net retention, I guess would be the best way to say that. So those are where I spend a lot of my time in my day to day.
Now, on the flip side of when we talk about like, okay, we prioritized our book, I think one thing to address is there's always going to be kind of that squeaky wheel, right? As we've talked about it, like that lower contract size customer that is asking for a lot of time. How have you kind of managed those so that you're not pulling away from what realistically your focus should be of those larger accounts that have a near term renewal, maybe lower perceived value, and not dedicating too much to the squeaky wheel, but kind of still keeping them healthy?
Yeah. My answer is one that is very much embedded in the fact that like just do the work and compartmentalize. Squeaky wheel, if you have a biweekly meeting set up with them, they know they have their dedicated time to talk to you. They also still might send you an email here and there. It doesn't take much to respond to an email or loop in your support team. So for me, any customer, doesn't matter if they're a squeaky wheel or not, like I'm giving them at least a half hour every other week to ask questions, to do hands-on work with me. If there's a need to do more in terms of like ad hoc meetings or live workshops with more teams, you do it. And I think that's kind of where like the size of your book of business comes into play. Obviously at 50, that might be a bit stressful for some CSMs. At 30, right, which as you said is kind of top end, like that to me feels pretty manageable to have that type of cadence and going. So squeaky wheels still have their dedicated time. And I feel like that goes a long way to making sure that they still reach out to you, but maybe not as much, maybe not as with much urgency, which oftentimes I see a lot of customers, right? Every email is important, every question is important. But if they have that dedicated time, it does kind of mitigate them a little bit, not much, but it does. How do you handle that? What would you say is your most effective tip or trick to handling a customer who really is going after a ton of your time, but might not necessarily be a priority right now?
I 100% agree with have a cadence meeting, like a biweekly or monthly. That's that dedicated time for that customer so they feel heard. You also have something where if they send you over a ton of items via email that you have to look into, you can say, okay, let's address this in our biweekly. But I think with squeaky wheels, make sure you're leaning on your counterparts. And, if they're sending over a ton of questions and they're technical questions, loop in support. Like, do not take more than 5 minutes, I think, to try to address those. If you don't know the answer, loop in that other team and just don't get sucked into like that email trap of trying to like play every hat.
Everybody that I talk to when I've talked to other CSMs in the industry, they're like, when I'm getting support questions, I just get lost in it. Like I drill in, I dig in, and I try to find the answer, which is good. You should try and find that answer so that way you can quickly address it if ever pops up again. But God, please realize when to raise the white flag, loop in support, bring somebody else in who is an expert that can help you. That goes such a long way to saving like your like mental health basically and your time. So I think that's really important. And I know we're coming up on time here, Chris. So we will end with one more hot take question that I love to ask other CSMs. How do you feel about participating in running trainings that maybe could be handled by somebody else or a counterpart, as you noted?
I think it really matters on where you're trying to take that account. I think if it's a big account and there's a lot of potential outcome in this team getting further enabled, I want to manage that training because I want to specifically put it together with the content I know is relevant. If it's a lower tier account, I think those are the ones where you really have to lean on those counterparts, train the trainer type of mentality, especially if there will be multiple trainings involved. But I think if you are going to run that training, try to make it as effective as possible. So like if I'm going to do one, I'm going to ask them for prep sessions so that we can kind of personalize this around that customer. And then also ensure that, we have all the necessary attendees. We have the frontline managers of the individuals that we're training bought in so that it's not just going to be using my time for us to never actually see an adoption of.
Yeah. That's a big component. I think I'm on the same wavelength. I try to understand like what is going to be the value added from doing this particular task. I think I still more am inclined to take any meeting that my customers need and run with it, or training. I'm happy to do it all just because I'm confident in my knowledge. But there's definitely prerequisites to it. Hey, you want me to do 4 sales trainings. Okay, I want to meet with the 4 different sales leaders of those respective teams so they know my face, they know my name, and I know theirs, and I can create a relationship with them. So that give and take there is always, always, always important. If you feel like you are going to take on more and you're willing to do more of the hands-on training work with customers, make sure you get something in return in the way of meeting the execs, getting business priorities, things of that nature will go a long way in the relationship. So
yeah, it sounds like we're going the same direction of like, if you're going to do it, it's a give get. Like if you're going to give, you have to have an outcome for yourself. And that's like, is it adoption? Is it renewal success? Is it just getting them on a better trajectory? But then also I think those relationships that can help you nurture.
Oh yeah. Being tactical with your customers is a great way to build those relationships. And I'll always beat that drum. Yes, being strategic is good, but don't forget to actually put the hands-on keyboard work in. Now, CS in 15, we did it in 17 today. So close to getting to our actual benchmark. But if you made it this far, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the content and we hope you tune in next time. Give us some feedback if you have it. We'd love to hear about topics you guys want to hear or just what you thought about the discussion we had today. But thanks for listening and we'll see you soon.